Welcome everyone to this online discussion. 75 years since Blindspots in World War II history. My name is Kristina Smolyaninovaite. I'm a deputy director at the Secretariat of EU-Russia Civil Society Forum based in Berlin. The forum was established in 2011 by non-governmental organizations, and it is a platform of, at the moment, 185 NGOs from Russia and the European Union, which are members and supporters of the forum. I am also managing the history program of the forum, Confronting Memories, that deals with historical memory. And with this program, we hope to create a space for a dialogue with diverse perspective on the history of the 20th century. Currently, our program, Confronting Memories, focus on work with history teachers from Belarus, Germany, Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. And I know some of the teachers are also here in the audience. They are designing lessons on World War II using a multi-perspectivity approach. Multi-perspectivity is for us a strategy for understanding in which we look into other perspectives in addition to our own and apply it in history lesson materials. There is no black and white, but we try to find the shades of gray in World War II history. We make our efforts to find points that unite us and have empathy to each other, despite difficult political contexts that some nations may experience. Today, we continue a series of discussion on the commemoration of World War II and ongoing social political debates revolving around its historical memory. We work with the topic on World War II because this war remains one of the most painful and conflicting episodes in the memories of nations across the world. World War II touches everyone. It is also difficult to say, for me, it was one World War II. It was many wars in one big war. There were different fights, different enemies, different wars, and this can be also observed today. So we started with our series of talks on World War II last September, where we focused more on European context. Then later we had a discussion which was focusing on Far East, in particular Japan and South Korea. And now this discussion, we shall look into 3 geographical blind spots in World War II history. It is North Africa, the Middle East, and South America, with topics that have not been discussed adequately. And we hope, and with this discussion, seek with this discussion a broader understanding of World War II history beyond the mainstream narratives, and we will try to draw lessons from human sufferings and injustice that are often overlooked. This event today is done in partnership with our friends and forum members, the Jan Nowak-Jezoransky College of Eastern Europe in Wrocław, and the New Eastern Europe Journal, which is published by the college. Here, I would also like to thank two persons who helped me to conceptualize this particular discussion on blind spots. It's Professor Dajing Yang from George Washington University and my friend from Singapore, Wong Che Meng. And of course, my dear colleagues at the Secretariat who helps me enormously to organize this discussion and this event. So I would like to give over now a word to our moderator, Professor Dudden from University of Connecticut. So she would be also introducing our speakers. So Professor Dudden, over you now.
Thank you so much, Kristina, and thank all the audience members for their interest in these topics, and the European Union, Russia civil society organizations and universities that are sponsoring this event. I think I was initially fascinated to learn of this event, particularly through the notion of blind spots in World War II. I think many of us in the middle of this rather surreal pandemic year around the world are faced with students who wonder why World War II matters anymore. And it matters especially as we can especially see forces of militarism rising and a lot of rhetoric echoing the rhetoric prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, which also turns focus on today's topics, today, the substance of today, very much North Africa, Latin America, and back to the Middle East as places not considered at the forefront of World War II, and yet we all casually use the term world for World War, meaning the entire world is engulfed in some connectivity to the events or absences of these events. And, you know, always as an American citizen, the term blind spot is first and foremost because we have a triumphalist narrative about the Second World War, which apparently for most Americans is a complete victory without considering the costs of what that entailed. And for the last 75 or 76 years, here I do math in public again, the United States has caused more death and carnage and ongoing war in a way that is not defined as a continuation of World War II, but perhaps might be best mediated as such. Here I'm taking, because history as such is a blind spot for most Americans, and I'm taking my cue from the fabulous poet at President Joseph Biden's inauguration, Amanda Gorman. And let me please quote one of the lines from her wonderful poem, The Hill We Climb, about the practice of history. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. And I think that when we think about why considering World War II matters today is to understand why history and the practice of history, learning and teaching history matters. As I understand it, history is an active verb, probably, and please forgive my French pronunciation, but faire l'histoire, to do history, to make history. And that's what we're here doing. And when there are absences and intersections among the absences, it's best to try to examine and excavate the reasons behind those absences, especially as we can tell that similar economic imperatives exist again today, similar tensions exist again today as they did in the 1930s. We also exist at a time in which the erasure of certain physical histories at the expense of preferred national memory is very much on the rise. This is perhaps most clearly evidenced right now in Poland, where some of our colleagues have stood trial for simply publishing that Poland participated in the genocide of Jews and others. You know, these are demonstrated facts. That gets into the broader question of what history and memory are and what the differences in their political and social deployment can be. We very clearly see around the world a weaponization of history for preferred national memory. And I have a colleague in the United States who comes from a country which shall remain nameless, and they practice history at a university that shall remain nameless, but they very clearly defined the difference between history and memory for me. And that is that history wars, debates about history do not have the power, the emotional power to lead to a shooting war, whereas memory wars can lead to actionable violence. And I put that out before we begin this conversation, which I think Christina most brilliantly explained is an effort to generate empathy for multiple perspectives, especially those of us teaching students who've never heard of the actual histories involved. Without further ado, please let me introduce our esteemed panel of speakers today. And then I'll turn it over to each speaker for a 15-minute presentation, open it up to the audience for conversation, questions in the chat box. And I'll mention now that if you do not feel your question has been answered by a speaker, please feel free to direct emails directly to my University of Connecticut email, and I will make sure that the speaker receives your question. I'm old, I'm not so good at multiple devices. Professor Omar Bohm, Professor of Anthropology at UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles, has deeply examined intersections of Middle East and North African histories, religious studies, regional violence, and with books that I've read, The Memories of Absence, Jews in Morocco, just a brilliant understanding of a particular moment in the 20th century that I highly recommend. Also a recently co-edited book on the Holocaust and North Africa. Professor Ernesto Bohoslavsky of the Universidad Nacional de General Sarmiento in Buenos Aires, long a researcher and student and brilliant interlocutor of 19th and 20th century Latin American revolutionary history, as well more in what I'm working on, so I've learned a lot, right-wing movements, ideology, the connection and interstices between Latin American anti-communism and Asian communism. Really I wish I read Spanish better, but I'm trying and I'm learning from you, thank you. One of my colleagues at the University of Connecticut is helping me with that. And Professor Joseph Bahu of the American University in Beirut, a pretty well-known public intellectual as well as a deep thinker, intellectual about Syrian, Lebanese, identity politics, as well as political histories and the need for governmental reform across the Arab world. Each of these distinguished professors brings to our conversation today an understanding of global absences in World War II discussions. So without further ado, let's go to Los Angeles now. Thank you.
Okay. Let me first share my. All right, thank you, Alexis. Thank you so much for this introduction. And it's really an honor to share this virtual floor with Joseph and Ernesto. And what I'm going to talk about is is one element of the blind spots in this period of the war, which is related to a project that arises from my interest as an anthropologist in oral history and stories and narratives of individuals, and particularly refugees who fled the war in Europe and other parts of the world and ended up in North Africa before they went either to the Americas via Lisbon, Portugal. So you raised, Christina and Alexis, you raised this issue of the rise of populism and nativism and nationalism, and how that really creates borders and distances individuals and societies from each other. And I think that's really pertinent in this period of the war. And that's why I think it's important as educators to pay attention to refugees and to stories of people who are displaced. I'll tell a story on the other side of the southern part, from the southern part of the Mediterranean. And it's a story that's all over North Africa, from Libya all the way to Morocco, and even including some part of West Africa. So this is just to give you, for those of you who are not familiar with the region, North Africa was mostly colonized by France. You have French Morocco, but you have also in Morocco the northern part and the southern part were colonized by Spain. Algeria was part of France, so it was a département within within Greater France. Libya was the only place that was colonized by Italy, and of course Tunisia also was a French colony. In this colonial period, going back to 1939, and especially after Vichy took over in 1940, in the summer of 1940, the General Pétain decided to revive a dream that Greater France had, which is a dream of connecting the Mediterranean to the rest of the Sahara and West Africa through a railroad system. And this idea here is basically to build a railroad system that would allow France to revive its power, especially after its defeat in 1870. That dream, France wanted to make it a reality by using the labor of a lot of people who fled Europe. And that's why actually, if you watched the film Casablanca, you would see that there is one phrase where he talks about les camps de travaux forcés. That's, I think, that's all of these dots you see here. Those are at some point war camps, were either detention camps, labor camp, or detention, labor camp, or concentration camp. There were no death camps in this region, but these mostly were camps where they were meant to either put refugees, whether women or children or men, in some camps, or whether you use them for this project, the railroad system project. And of course, we have a small section of West Africa. There were also some camps in sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa, especially in Senegal, in Mali, and in Guinea. So this is the project would end in Oran, at least in the first phase of it, and would begin in sub-Saharan Africa, and then at some point would be connected to Senegal. What's interesting here is that you have about 10,000 at least refugees. You have Spanish Republicans, you have Jews, and you have also North Africans themselves too. So that's, I think, what part of thinking about this history is really to figure out how this war impacted the lives of these communities. This is one of the remaining. It's interesting to think here about the railroad in the story of Europe, how the road takes to the death camps, how the road takes to the labor camps. It's interesting even within this camp how people talk about shoes, how people talk about clothes, and all of these. So, and one way to do it is to use the oral histories and use also biographies. One of the most important biographies that are left today are biographies by Max Ob, Diaro de Jelfa, the Diary of Jelfa. There is also few diaries left by Muslims who were interned in these camps. Trois années de camp by Berkani, for instance. And then we don't have a lot of documents from this region, but one of the things I'm pushing here as far as my research is really to make sure that we collect histories and stories of both Jews and Muslims and other Christians in order to write this story. And I think that would be essential to think about the war, so that we don't marginalize and we don't silence stories of other groups in order to rewrite this history. These are just some of the maps, some of the pictures that highlight. This is the camp of Jelfa. The idea of the camp also, from a comparative perspective, if we want to think about the war, how we think and how we write the story of the war in Europe is also, we can do it also to enlarge the scope of thinking of students, from K through 12, as well as university level. So this is one of the camps. This is the camp of Jelfa, and you can see the Marabout tents. You can see also the whole construction, how it's different. We can also use official documents. I am for combining the official documents, state documents, but without neglecting the oral histories, individual stories, because those are the ones that will really enlarge how we think about, or at least inform how we think about these stories. And part of this is really the materiality of the war. The materiality of the war can be in terms of pictures, in terms of clothing, but also in terms of drawings. The drawings tell us a story of how this story should be told. Not only a story from a Muslim perspective, but also it could be from a Jewish perspective, a Christian perspective too. And I want to end by saying how we, as an anthropologist, and especially a historical anthropologist, what are the possibilities we have today to write about the war? Do we write about this period just in terms of ethnographies, or do we write about it in different forms? And what I'm pushing here, what I'm trying to think about, being influenced by a lot of scholars and a lot of works of different. This influence is coming mostly from the needs of the teachers, K through 12 teachers that I work with in different forms, is to think about the project of what I call writing, having a comic story. And this is part of a project that I'm working on with an Algerian artist. And this is basically, it's called the Undesirables, and it literally tells the story of these refugees who fled the war, who are either ended up in detention camps or labor camps or penal camps. And I will end it here. That's all I have to say.
Omar, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I must concur that what you've just emphasized before I get into a collective remark, reading has changed among students. And so your approach to create a manga, as we would say in Japan, a comic history of these moments is critical, because we can convey, we know that from Art Spiegelman's Mouse, we know that from so many really successful presentations, they're not necessarily different histories, it's a different way that we teach. And I really applaud that effort. I can't wait to read The Undesirables. Without further ado, let's go to Buenos Aires.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon. I have decided to present which are, according to me, the two main particular Argentinian points of view and ways to remember World War II. I have 15 minutes. I don't know if I will be able to talk about them. I mean, I try to do it in a very sketchy way. What I propose for this discussion on is the idea that it's interesting to think which were the World War II impacts in a peripheral region. I mean, a region in which there were minor military operations and combats, and where most of the nations did not participate formally or meaningfully in the war scenarios in Europe, in Africa, or in Asia. So what I'd like to suggest is that there are two particular and long-lasting impacts of World War II over Argentine political imaginaries and representations. One is the idea of that the Peronist Argentina was a particular sanctuary for the arrival of a great number of Nazi war criminals after 1945, and the other long-lasting impact is a recurrent assimilation of our last dictatorship with the Holocaust experience. I think that those are our particular points of view about the World War. In 1945, there was an electoral campaign in Argentina. One of the candidates was the Colonel Perón. In that year, the Department of State launched and published the so-called Blue Book, which contained many denouncements about the connections between Perón and the Third Reich. That denounced the collaboration of Peron and his government with the Nazi German and with the arrival of refugees. That idea, that was essentially an electoral device, finally has become sort of permanent black legend on Peronism. That idea was clearly reinforced by the presence in Argentina of relevant Nazi authorities, Croatian Ustaša, French collaborationists, also by one of the Mussolini's sons who lived in Buenos Aires for many years, the kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann in the outskirts of Buenos Aires in 1960, well, that facts clearly reinforced these international suspicions on the complicities between Peronism and the Third Reich war criminals. This version has received since then a great attention, especially in the US, where regularly are produced TV shows, documentaries, and journal pieces about this supposed massive arrival of Nazi war criminals, submarines, treasures. No, you have even the more esoteric versions that include that include the version of Hitler having his last days in Patagonia, no, as an elderly man. This idea, finally, this perspective on the links between Peronism and the Third Reich, finally has, I think it has a well-documented version after the 90s. In a previous discussion, Christina referred that some history teachers in Central Europe schools affirmed that the World War II really ended in 1989, not in 1945. No? Well, let me tell you that probably in Argentina, the World War II finished even later. In 1992, there was a bomb attack against the Israel embassy in Buenos Aires. In 1994, there was another bomb attack against the Jewish Community Healthcare Association that caused approximately 100 dead people. That episode, those attacks were followed by pressures from the US government, Israel government, and also the local Jewish community in order to find the intellectual authors and the direct responsibles for the attack. The attacks were perceived as the result not just of a very, very bad intelligence apparatus, but also as the consequence of a supposed long-lasting sympathy to the Nazi point of view in the what we call the Argentine deep state, no? in intelligence community. So that supposed Nazi sympathy in intelligence apparatus was responsible for establishing this particular cooperation links with the Muslim terrorism in the 90s. So that Nazi sympathy in the 90s was considered to be not just a potential, but an actual nutritive soil for the ethnic hatred in the country. So the idea of that Argentina was a long-lasting anti-Semitic hatred and complicity that had to be removed from the very roots. So the President Menem decided to open the access to all the public archives that could contain information about the arrival of European war criminals. And he went further by creating a special commission on Nazis' activities in Argentina, a commission to research on those topics, which was composed by very well-known historians from Europe, from Israel, from the US, and from Argentina. that commission made a great job in the 90s. They traveled to, I don't know, to Croatia, to Germany, to the US. They made all the archives, they made it public. So now we have a very, very well documented information on the arrival of war criminals. And what we know is that this idea of that Argentina was a sanctuary, an open airport for the criminals, must be seriously reconsidered. Professor Holger Meding estimated that approximately between 1% and 2% of the main leaders, of the main Nazi leaders, eventually arrived to Argentina after World War II. Among the SS chiefs, only Alvensleben arrived to our country. Among the Einsatzgruppen chiefs, only one of them came to the country. A random study over 100 Nazi leaders and state officers offered very important facts. This was a sample study made on a base of almost 5,000 Nazi leaders and state officers. It was estimated that approximately 2% of them finally came to Argentina. According to this collective research, the Nazi leaders who arrived to the country were 70. What is interesting to know, what we could mention as a blind spot, is the fact that arrived much more French and Belgian collaborationists than German people. It was estimated that more than 100 French and Belgian collaborators moved to Argentina. The French and the Belgian government requested the extradition of some of them, but all the requests were systematically denied by Argentine authorities. In fact, some French collaborationists reached a very comfortable economic and political position in the country. One of them, Saxe-Marie Desmarais, who was an old comrade of Action Française, finally became sort of Peronist intellectual. He directed the political school, a Peronist political school in the 60s. And probably Argentina was more a sanctuary for the Croatian war criminals than for the Shermans. No? Ante Pavelic, the leader of the Ustašian, lived in Argentina with other 30 important Ustaša leaders. So when we think about if this story of the red lines of the war criminals who reach Argentina is taught, I think that it's important to perceive that probably is considered to be historical content to be taught, but that is identified as an anti-Peronist content to be taught. So probably those teachers who decide to say something about this story in their classrooms are also politically motivated, no? And so those who decide not to talk about these stories are also politically motivated, since it becomes a sort of uncomfortable topic to be treated. I mean, it's uncomfortable because it can produce some kind of effect nowadays. No? So it's a sort of a living past. The second topic that I would like to talk about is this particular assimilation that was made after 1983 between the Holocaust experience and the Argentine dictatorship. It's interesting that this assimilation was encouraged, for instance, by artists as Leon Ferrari, who made great paintings with the images of Hitler and Videla, the national dictator, which some kind of collages and paintings in which you can find images of Auschwitz and the national concentration camps. But that simulation was also made by judiciary agents as prosecutors and judges. They used terms and also laws and discussions that were used in Nuremberg in order to condemn the dictators. That assimilation is used also by the victims when they offer when they speak about their experience. But it's interesting that that assimilation has a sort of perverse side, which is that in many torture rooms during the dictatorships, the victims have identified that there were Hitler's portraits, and also used as intimidatory pieces. There was during the dictatorship, there was an overrepresentation of Jewish victims among the kidnapped and the murdered. There are a lot of denunces of that the torture sessions were even tougher for Jewish people, and they received specific anti-Semitic courses during the torture sessions. In 1985, there was a very famous for us trial against the dictators, the perpetrators. And interestingly, the documentary of that trial, it's called The Argentine Nuremberg. So it's our Nuremberg version. In the last 15 or 20 years, this assimilation has continued to reproduce and to spread. In 2010, the ministry, the education ministry, launched a special program called Education and Memory. They have produced very important, rich, interesting textbooks about how to teach Holocaust and how to teach dictatorship. In the words that the program used to introduce one of the textbooks are these: not all the societies created concentration and extermination camps. That's why asking ourselves about the conditions that made the camps possible becomes a responsibility as educators and also as citizens. In this sense, reflecting on an experience as the Holocaust can shed light on the Argentinian case. So this assimilation is not just, it's not random, it's politically based. No? It has a pedagogical use. The idea of that the civilizatory challenge that the Holocaust offered to the humanity was repeated in Argentina during the dictatorship. I could say more that this term of genocide, which is used very frequently here, has become a sort of intense quarrels among scholars, but also within the chassis, within the judiciary, you know, about if it's possible, if it's legitimate, if it suits to the Argentine experience. Anyway, in spite that you have a lot of legal problems to use the term genocide, it's impossible. I think it's impossible to stop the social use usage of the term. In fact, the term genocide has begun to be used in order to refer to military campaigns at the end of the 19th century, no? Military campaigns against indigenous societies. So what we can perceive is, I will finish with this, is there's another particular heritage of the World War II and the Holocaust experience, which is reenacted by the Argentinians in order to think themselves and in order to include their particular violent history into a larger stream of the 20th century disgraces. That's it. Thank you.
Ernesto, thank you so much. And I look forward to the conversation following, particularly your on-spot point about the social conditions that make camps possible. And I think that's a sort of globality that comes out. It certainly starts in the 19th century and can connect transnationally. I also really liked your criminality, collaboration, and complicity framework. Onward to Beirut.
Yeah, thank you, Alexis. Good evening, everyone, and I mean, good morning, depending on where you are. In fact, I was a bit puzzled when I was proposed to participate in this panel, because I didn't know exactly what to talk about concerning the Middle East, because in a way, in the collective memory and the historiography of this region, the most important tragic event of the 20th century is more World War I than World War II, at least in the Levant, in the part of the world which I will tackle. I mean, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, and etc. World War I is exactly, first of all, the period under which the Ottoman Empire will crumble after 4 centuries of domination, like all other empires in the Western world. But also it's concomitantly the period of the state formation. The borders are drawn within the period of post-World War I. And World War I itself is, for the people of the region, at least in Syria and Lebanon, a very traumatic memory in terms of tragic events, famine, fled, emigration. Ernesto is Argentinian, and he knows that probably most of the Turcos, of the Syrian Lebanese emigrants to Latin America, have fled during World War I because they were fleeing terrible plights like famine, massacres, displacement, mass displacements, and etc. Compared to that, of course, I mean, Second World War was also a very marking event in the Levant and in the Middle East or in the Near East. But compared to World War I, it was really benign. And I would say for some parties, maybe fortunate and not unfortunate. It was a period of independence, of emancipation, of elite taking over the countries in Syria, Lebanon, in Jordan, in Iraq, maybe. It was the period where we can also trace, maybe, and I'll come back to that, the birth or the creation of a state of Israel. So it was not exactly the same, let's say, the same way it was lived elsewhere in the world. Now, if this is, I think, a very important reminder, because if you interrogate public memory, collective memory, historiography, and other documents, you find much more concentration of events and tragic traces pertaining to World War I than to World War II. In a nutshell, if I have to summarize this point, I would say that World War I was the period of formation of nations and states, and World War II was more the period of their coming to independence and political fruition. Now, if I have to think about what are the blind spots or the things that we don't talk enough about in this region during World War II or having to do with World War II, some things come to my mind. The first one is, at least for Syria and Lebanon, something that is not documented enough, which is the Franco-French competition and rivalry. We tend to forget that when World War II starts, this part of the world, Syria, Lebanon at least, is, and this is a direct consequence of World War I, of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and other agreements, this part of the world is under French mandate. But so when France falls under the occupation and under the Vichy rules, these two countries are in the beginning under the Vichy rules. And there is a very quick competition and rivalry that is not exactly military. And this is what's interesting, between the Gaullist forces and the Vichy, the Pétainist forces in these two countries. And we barely find books, articles, documents, images, pictures, and other documents and traces about the way the power was transferred or handled from Vichyist France to Gaullist France. It happened somewhere in 40-41, and it's interesting because at that moment, de Gaulle will visit Beirut in a very historical visit, and there's still a building here in Beirut, in an old neighborhood of Beirut, bearing a kind of plaque, reminding this historical visit. He will spend maybe several weeks or 1 or 2 months here in Beirut. And this has constructed a lot the mythology of the bond between Lebanon and Gaullist France after that. In itself, it was a very anecdotal event, not very important, but it took importance later on. I mean, like many other mythologies or legends that are overconstructed a posteriori. But so we don't know enough about this transfer of power between Vichy France and Gaullist France. And this is, I think, one of the issues that would be worth for historians to maybe inquire a little bit more and to delve into it. Because also it has to do, and this is maybe another question, it has to do also with part of the elite formation of Lebanon and Syria after the independence. Most of these elites were very much tied to France before the war. Most of them were Francophone, Francophiles, studied in France, high bourgeoisie families that used to have property in Paris, spent their summers in France, and etc. And I think it is very interesting to see how they managed to move themselves, their loyalties from one camp to another, which is, I don't want to be cynical and silly also, is something very familiar to the elites in this part of the world, shifting very quickly loyalty and allegiance from one occupier to the other. And I heard that there are some correspondences, some letters from the same persons, from the same notables, writing to the French High Commissioner, who is a Vichy civil servant, letters of complete allegiance and loyalty to France under Pétain, and then the week after or the month after, writing the same letter to the new High Commissioner of de Gaulle, saying exactly the same thing, and people asking, I mean, what exactly is this guy standing for? And this is something that we are unfortunately still living into in this part of the world. Mainly in Lebanon, I should say, unfortunately. The second blind spot that is much resembling to this one has to do later on in the 42-43 period with the Franco-British competition. And also, this is an interesting point because we tend to think that, of course, there's a Franco-British bloc against Nazi Germany and Italy and etc. But in fact, the competition between France and Great Britain that you can, of course, read and look at in London itself between Churchill and de Gaulle and the kind of irritation between the two men who both had a very acute sense of history and their place and role in history, of course, differently, but more or less the same in expression, it played out in Lebanon and Syria. And we can even say, and I think historians have worked on that independence in Lebanon and Syria, that was also, it's interesting to note that it will happen during Second World War, not after Second World War. It happens in 43, in November 43. It is a direct result of probably a very sideshow of rivalry and conflict between London and Paris. And this is where the elites, the notables I was talking about a minute ago, in Lebanon and Syria will steal, in a way, will seize the moment of this rivalry in order to steal independence, in a way. I mean, to take it in a kind of maybe moment of inattention by both France and Germany and Britain, which is also something I think very interesting. Now, of course, the French will physically evacuate Lebanon and Syria in 46, but the independence is proclaimed at a moment where both these countries have much more important things to do, and where France, in fact, does not exist. France is not France. France is, as the maps that Omar has shown a while ago, was divided, was torn, legitimacy, political legitimacy was inexistent or divided and torn. And this is an interesting moment in political history to think about an independence that is taken under such an international, let's say, context and conjuncture. I think it's very rare to have such a moment of independence of a country that is occupied or under the tutelage of a country that is itself occupied and under tutelage, and which government is frankly unknown. I mean, we don't know where France is, where official France is. And this is, I think, a second blind spot, which I think is interesting to inquire further. The third one is more touchy and more, let's say, sensitive. It has to do with something that will occur mainly after Second World War, but we can trace the roots to the war itself, and mainly also to things that has happened between World War I and World War II, which is, in fact, the Zionist immigration to what will become later on Israel, the Zionist immigration to Palestine, and what was happening in Palestine, in the land of what is historically Palestine, or Transjordan and Palestine, under the British mandate during the Second World War. Of course, the legend or the historiography or the common sense tends to say that Israel was created in April, May 48 because of the guilt feeling of Europe under the Holocaust and the kind of compensation mechanism and etc. And that the Jewish lobby was able to extract or to seize the moment of the creation of Israel because of the post-Second World War period and the climate in Europe. It is very, very partly true, but we also tend to forget that some dynamics were already at play during Second World War. During the years of the plight of Jews and the Jewish population in Europe, there was something happening in what will become Israel and Palestine, and the partition in 47 by the Jewish communities that were living in Palestine at that moment and not being submitted to the persecution they were submitted to in Europe. And this is a part of history that has to do with Israel, the history of Zionism, and the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict that is still shaping and informing this part of the world, that is underlit, underworked on, under-examined. Of course, something else is under-examined, although it's a more, let's say, nasty and less, less honorable part of the Arab history, which is in fact the ties that were existing between some Arab elites, mainly Palestinian elites, and Nazi Germany and fascist Europe. I mean, the ties between the Mufti of Jerusalem that are well documented between him and Hitler personally, his visit to Berlin, and his hope maybe that the problem of Palestine that was existing at that time already would be solved, quote unquote, through the eradication of the Jewish population in Europe. This is, I think, a very interesting point of history, especially if, and it has to do with things that Ernesto have alluded to, especially when you look at also, which is something fascinating to me, some of the parties, the political parties and forces that will become very active and prominent after Second World War, in the first time of independence in some of the Arab countries, mainly Syria and Lebanon, trace back their origin intellectually and organizationally to the period of the Second World War and to something that is more or less gravitating in the orbit of worldwide fascism and Nazism. I mean, if you take, for example, the Syrian National Party that will become very strong in the history of Syria after the war and in Lebanon until today, this is a party that is, first of all, created, and this will probably be interesting to Ernesto. It is created by a Lebanese expatriate in Latin America, Antoun Saadi, who's from Mount Lebanon, a Greek Orthodox from Mount Lebanon, who will be very much shaped intellectually by ideas of right-wing populism in Latin America, then will absorb a lot of doses of Nazi literature and fascist literature, up to the level that he will become a scientific anti-Semite, like European anti-Semites. And he will develop the ideology of his party very much along the lines of the Volk, the power of the people, bloody nationhood, and etc. And this is very interesting also because this is a page of history that is still enduring and ongoing in this part of the region and really traces back to exactly what was happening during Second World War in other parts of the world and was imported to this part of the world, the Middle East. I will not go further, but maybe in a later stage in the round of questions, we could maybe reflect on the difference of temporalities and the way things are perceived and lived, comparing World War I and World War II between our regions and the regions that we are examining today, and see which one was more formative and informative for these regions, for this or the other region. Thank you so much.
Joseph, thank you, especially for ending with or concluding with different temporalities. And I've been taking copious notes here because several of your points about a sort of a sideshow rivalry, the Franco-British competition, as well as the shift of loyalties from one occupier to another, especially as an American citizen watching or observing the history of my country take over much of East Asia in the wake of the collapse of the Japanese Empire. The shift of pull down the Japanese flag and hoist the American flag and send the same letter to MacArthur that one might have sent to Hirohito the week before. It's pretty fabulous. And we have a lot going on here. I think each of you has touched on state formation, the importance of borders and fueling those with ideologies that depend on sort of transnational references to a history of horror and a history of violence, something that permeates each of these discussions. We have several questions in the chat box. I could talk forever because I'm learning so much, and this is really, it's a pandemic and I'm learning something I don't know, so I'm really excited. So I'll shut up now until I get to ask more questions. But please, several of you have posed questions in Cyrillic and I can't read that. So if somebody could write some of them in English, we have one in English that I can read. My apologies for my lack of languages on this particular front. We have an excellent question from Rafał Pankowski, Never Again Association, that I'll just read and anyone on the panel or each of the panelists could respond. What do you think we can learn from the globality of World War II to build global solidarity across continents, against contemporary instances of human rights abuses and genocide. And we can perhaps Ernesto wants to begin with revisiting, I think, your really brilliant insights to how this one touchstone that is the United Nations first definition of genocide in the wake of the Nazi Holocaust. And yet we've got Raphael Lemkin using the Armenian genocide to define genocide, but the world needed to know about Nazis before figuring it out. And yet we have ongoing instances of genocide. And I should make clear, I am sitting on Native American soil made possible by the genocide of the Pequots. So it's, here we are. Would anybody like to address the globality of histories of World War II to address or to cope with ongoing histories of extreme violence? I should emphasize the state-sponsored nature of the violence we're talking about.
Okay, thanks, Alexis, for the question. I do not have something very solid to say about, but I could say I am skeptical about the human capability to learn about the past. When I decided to study history, I felt exactly the opposite. I thought that we could learn from our mistakes and then, I don't know, living in a better world. Nowadays, I am a bit more pessimistic about that. What I could say is that probably the World War II has spread feelings of global solidarity, but did not invent them. I think, for instance, watching the problem from Latin America, I think that the Spanish Civil War was probably much more important in order to stimulate these particular international identifications. The perception of that in the Madrid battle, there were not faced just two Spanish enemies, but two particular transnational enemies, which generated assimilation and also rejection. So the Spanish Civil War contributed firmly to the development of these global solidarities that for sure fought against other global solidarities. The fascist governments also launched their own global connections and solidarity movements. It's clear that the fascist side of the world was not as strong as the anti-fascist movements. But in my opinion, I think we have to think of globality much more as a contested field, much more than as a universal stream potentially shared by all the people. I think that we could think much more in terms of competing global projects, more than as the emergence of unified global conscience.
I think let me add something to. I think I'm going to build on Joseph's really pertinent contribution in terms of his thoughts about World War I versus World War II. And I think what Joseph has mentioned is really connected to this question, because first of all, we have to think about the meanings of the war and the meanings of the trauma to each group. So I think which is linked to somehow to, first of all, we have to translate the experiences of each groups, and before we start talking about the commonality, because every nation, every group within every nation is coming from, in terms of class, they're coming from their own perspective. And I think until we do that, that's why, first of all, we have to learn more about the facts. And this is where the archives, history, oral history, and so on and so forth are important. Then when we get to these discourses of what's common and how we can build these solidarities, I think that's something that would come next. Are we there? I don't think so. I don't think we're not there yet. And but we will be there. That's why a panel like this and the conversation with teachers like this are important. We'll be there if we are able to translate these experiences to the students through their own languages and through the experience of their own people, the experience of their own communities. And I think that's potentially the best I think the best solution to building these alliances in the future.
Joseph, would you like to say something there?
Yeah, in fact, I don't have much to say or to add, but I would maybe bounce back on the last point made by Omar. What strikes me in this part of the world regarding World War II is the very and this is where I completely concur with Ernesto about the pessimism or the skepticism about learning something from this on the global scale. What strikes me here in this part of the world is the very deeply entrenched denialism of certain things that have happened in Europe, for example, in Eastern Europe or in Europe. I think the Middle East, I don't know scientifically, but I have the feeling that it is probably the part of the world where denialism of the Holocaust and etc. is the strongest, probably in the collective, in the popular discourse, in the popular, let's say, narrative and etc. And this has to do, of course, with the Arab-Israeli problem, but it is not read as a European traumatic event. It is read as a part of the Arab-Israeli conflict and not as part of the European history, the traumatic and very difficult European history. And for someone who, for example, like me, who teaches political history in the American university. I used to teach political science in France for 15 years. Now I've been teaching this in Lebanon, and I can see how the perception, the cultural perception, sometimes the conviction that is entrenched in the minds and the heads of the students is very different. They don't live the same event the same way, and sometimes they even deny that this event has happened, or they minimize it. So we're still very far from having constructed a global awareness towards these issues, and I think that I would agree with my two colleagues that this is something that will probably take much more efforts and energy and probably intellectual input to construct.
If I could just add in from East Asia, where I think in East Asia, we run a close second, if not a neck and neck tie on denialism. The East Asian denialism of certain factual occurrences aided and abetted by the United States government's determination to sweep history under the rug in order to build an anti-communist bloc at all costs immediately following the defeat of Japan, to the extent that I think only in American high school or American history textbooks is the word good used with the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's an untranslatable word in any other nation's history, which I guess I would emphasize very much Omar's, especially to the teachers in the audience, who are coming up with lesson plans of a multi-perspectival approach to this particular era of the 20th century, the multiplicity of materials, as many different source materials as possible. Those of us who are doing the speaking today all have our degrees we've obtained our PhDs at times in which you needed a certain amount of certain materials to pass your exams. And there's a sort of hierarchy of documented archival evidence. Omar very smartly put up a US government document to show that a certain history had taken place. And we also have a diary, a first-person account. And I think for those teaching this in areas around the world today, we're still in a position of hearing from survivors of some of these atrocities, some of these histories of terror that really do reach students in a new way. And I find that the first person voice, while of course always needs to be substantiated as any criminal trial would do, you know, you're making a claim against a state, and making any claim against a state apparatus is probably the single most difficult thing to do, regardless of whether one's in a dictatorship or a democracy, actually. And so bringing these claims forward through diaries, through songs, through film footage, while it is still possible to bolster the argument with a living survivor, is key in terms of reaching students in a new way to explain the potential cataclysm of another war on this scale. And I don't mean to be the voice of darkness, but I am actually increasingly terrified of the rhetoric of the rise of China. I mean, the United States is clearly positioning itself to have another global conflict. Whether or not it comes to pass, we obviously hope does not happen. But the rhetoric is building in a way that one sees similar patterns in the 1930s. And therefore, it's imperative on those of us who have access to the generation for which nothing is inevitable until it happens, to introduce the costs of such cataclysmic violence. And that's through individual stories, through the people caught in state webs of terror that bring it forward. And I agree with the panelists that finding a global World War II history, we're not there yet. Finding, I'm thinking of Achille Mbembe's wonderful work, A Global History of Violence. I think we're closer to understanding and bringing it to the fore that way. We have a question from Frank Fable. If memory on World War II is still contested, as Ernesto said, could it not be that the contest is which fraction has the better concept of a multi-directional memory? Everybody nowadays is multi-directional, even the extreme right. Anyone can take it.
Okay, I don't know if there are more than one legitimate memory on the World War II. In my opinion, even the losing countries, the defeated countries, I think that shared and teach the version that is taught and remembered in the winning countries. I think that we can perceive this with the celebrations of the end of the world, no? The celebrations with the 75 years or with the 50 years. I think there are not competitive memories about the global meaning of the World War II. I think that only very marginal, minor actors think that the war was won by by the wrong guy, no? Which is exactly opposite to the Leonard Cohen's songs. So I think that we do not have a competitive, legitimate versions about the World War II. I think that probably it's much more intense, as Joseph has pointed out, the debate, the so-called debate about the Holocaust. No, I think that's becoming more and more a space where the most esoterical, denialist, and bad intention positions are really acquiring legitimacy and audience. So I would be much more concerned about how Holocaust will be remembered, who will remember, and much more than by the problem of the memory of the World War II, that according to me has become much more one of these typical historical national episodes that probably speak nothing to the new generations. You know, these kind of facts which are really dead. In my opinion, probably 1945 it's for most of the Europeans, it's a dead year. In the sense that it does not generate this kind of quarrels or intense discussions. I mean, in that sense, the process of building the European Union probably has finally contributed to depoliticize the memory about the war. So finally, all of them became Europeans, but not all of them became Jews, and not all of them want to become Jews or to identify with those victims. So, from my point of view, I think that I could watch with much more attention that discussion than the other one about the memory of the World War II.
I tend to agree with Ernesto on this. I think, and I think the way we remember actually and how we really think about previous events. I can think of what the Germans did in Namibia, for instance, before World War II, and something also connected to Joseph's point about World War I. I think a lot of the killing of this is something which is also a footnote in the history of the World War II. How European powers, how the Germans, how the French, the Vichy, how they treated sub-Saharan Africans, how race is also became part of the you have the anti-Jewish laws, but you have also anti-racial laws against African soldiers that were killed, that many of them won the war. Europe won the war because of the French tirailleurs, but we don't talk about them. But also, we don't talk about how World War II, the role of the Senegalese tirailleurs in winning World War I for France impacted the way the Germans went about their racial laws through anthropology and other in the period between the wars. So I think that's I agree with you, and I think we have to really be cognizant of these past events, and how can we? The question is, how can we make people interested in these stories at a time where we are where people are interested in different social encounters, social media, and all these things. So that's it. How do you make history a topic of passion again to people? And that's the struggle. That's our struggle as educators.
Thank you, Joseph. Did you have something there too?
Maybe what I have to say here is not very much related to this point, but it has to do with it. I have the feeling, maybe in line with what I said, that in fact in the Near East, in the Middle East, the World War II itself is a blind spot in a way. Let me say why. First of all, because World War I is more important in terms of creation of events. But also because for many parts of the world, World War II was maybe the last real big war. In fact, in the Middle East, it was only the start of a series of other wars that were really catastrophic. I mean, the Arab-Israeli War of 48, then the aggression of 56, and then the big war of 67, that which consequences we are still living in, the occupation of the land of Jerusalem, etc., then the war of 73, then the war of 82 in Lebanon, and then the Lebanese war, and then the Syria war, and then Libya. And so if you compare this to the memory of other parts of the world, we could say that World War II was, to paraphrase a very beautiful book on World War I, paradoxically, a war to end all wars. In fact, World War II was the start of all wars for the Middle East. So in a way, it went into oblivion because it is something that went unnoticed. First of all, because there was no battles, in fact, properly speaking, in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine during World War II, but everything started after that. So I think that also it's important to interrogate the historical perception of peoples in this part of the world and other parts of the world and compare them towards one event. I think it's a fascinating exercise also.
I completely concur. Omar has just said World War II is a blind spot. I study Korea. There were no battles. Many Koreans had their lives stolen from them and forced into forced labor for the Japanese Empire. Yet there were no battles in Korea, and yet Korea is the longest civil war we've got in Asia today, still ongoing. So yeah, World War II was not over in Asia. It was the catalyst. If World War I was not, when Japan was on the Allies' side and then switched empires, as it were. So we have time for questions that I may not be seeing in the chat or hearing from the interlocutors. Are there questions that I don't know about that should be addressed while we still have a few minutes? And if not, I have the one question that we've been asked that we have certainly, each of you has touched on brilliantly. Omar, perhaps most powerfully, how do we make history matter at a time when we have, I don't know if the American English expression fun fact is a global expression right now, but sitting here in my living room teaching history over Zoom for an entire year, I've come to think that the practice of history is now being reduced to fun facts. And without going into complete paroxysms of despair, I still believe it matters, because I believe, and it's a very weak understanding of the praxis of history, but it is precisely what we're discussing, to try not to repeat the mistakes of the past, but to learn from the choices made which led to the devastating violences of the past, and to try to make the world just a little bit better. And I say this when there are ongoing instances in each of our locations that have echoes to what we've seen. And Omar, I'm glad you mentioned Germans in Namibia, because this predates World War I, it predates World War II, and the wars are ongoing. We have been asked if we had one thing each to say in terms of lessons learned, if you each have a 1-minute statement for teaching these blind spots and why they might matter. If I could ask each of you to comment. Thank you. In any order.
Okay, thanks for this final impossible to answer question. No, I think that many things could be said about which are the historian's burden, and especially the history teacher in the classrooms. Many things, in fact, were already said about that. What I'd say, attending to the potential presence of teachers in the audience, is not to overestimate our capacities. I mean, we have some responsibility, but we are not the responsible for the state of the world. So we can, and in fact, we teach the students, but we do not have the complete responsibility for what people do. So I think that education matters, history matters, but I am not sure if in 2021 is what really matters more. So probably we need much more activities outside the classrooms. We need more meaningful activities for the students. And the second thing that I could say is something that is also very well known among the teachers and among the scholars who study the memory, and is that the only way to keep a memory alive is also betraying it. The only way to keep a memory going and meaningful for the people is that it speaks about the present, not just as a statue of an old man that has to be glorified. So the only memory that really works is the one that is alive. So to be alive means that has to stop talking just about the past that is dead, and also has to speak every day more about current topics and concerns. So in that sense, is that betraying the memory is is unavoidable, and probably it's a good evil. That's it.
Wow, that's a very tough question. Just like, but I think what I can say is that I'm very lucky as a human being and as a person to be raised in a context where I've seen different generations, and for us, history is taught through the wisdom of old men and women who experienced World War I, who experienced World War II, and their stories of famine, how they can't even find cloth to bury the dead, all these really minute, minuscule stories and anecdotes are very, very personal, very relatable. So you can relate to them. You can relate to the fact that somebody was going through World War I in the 1943, and there is a famine, there is a war. The Germans are directing the food supplies from France to mainland Germany, and then the French can't provide the flour to the colonies. And then listening to these stories through the voice of my father, for instance, that's what made me aware of the importance of the war. Why these things matter? Why do I need to teach them to my daughter? But then when I look at my daughter doesn't want to read a 200 pages book. So I have to find a way how to relate to her again, how to tell the story. And the fascinating things I see about this new generation is that the visuals. So for me, that's where the comic and the graphic novel came. So I want to tell this story, the same story that I heard from my dad and from generations of my dad to my daughter, and to hopefully generations and kids her age. So we have, as Ernesto mentioned, this idea, we have to make it part of the present. And to make it part of the present, we have to make sure that it relates to, first of all, what we lived and how our kids can actually listen to us, because you can't teach if you don't have a listening ears. And that's where I would end.
Yeah. Okay. I agree. It's a very, very tricky question, and in fact, I don't really have an answer. But I would say something that could appear contradictory to what Omar just said. But in fact, I would say maybe the lesson is not to read the past and history with the eyes of the present and the prejudices. I mean, the prejudgments of the present. Not to, let's say, make an a posteriori reading of events. I think this is probably the most important in order to build a real memory. it is not contradictory to what Omar said. It could sound contradictory, but it's not the same. I mean, you can't read the history of, for example, the Holocaust in World War II with the lenses of the Arab-Israeli conflict. This would lead you to something that is not only false historically, but dangerous politically, and this is very important. The other point has to do with what Ernesto said. Maybe I would maybe advise to read more and to think about the real plight of people, of ordinary people, and maybe read more novels and see more films and read more comics than read arid historical books. Sometimes it gives you a better clue of what really happened for people than reading a textbook or a treatise or an essay. But I know that this is not something that would be welcome by the community of professors.
I agree with each.
I agree 100% with you.
I agree 100%. Totally. And thank you all. I really appreciate everything that we've learned today in the audience. To echo Omar, you can't teach without a listener. And we've all benefited from your insights and approach and knowledge and perspectives. Christina, I'll hand it back to you. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, everyone, and especially our speakers, Joseph, Omar, and Ernesto, and our moderator, Alexis. And we learned something more about the blind spots, and at the end we found out that the blind spots is World War II itself, and also this is something. Like it's interesting discussion, and it's new things that we learned, and I'm sure also teachers also had taken some tips and something broad will bring from this discussion. And once again, I would like to remind people who would like, or in the audience, someone would like to have some more questions answered. You can also write to us, and we will direct those questions to Alexis and to the speakers. And here I would like to encourage to follow our Facebook, and soon we will also have our website for Confronting Memories history program, and that's where you will find also out about our upcoming events, and also you can find these new lessons that we designed, or the teachers designed, based on the multi-perspectivity approach. So you can read them, and you can see how these lessons were made, especially in the context of the Eastern Europe and Russia. So thank you all, and have a good day and evening, and until next time. Bye-bye.